The first thing the detective noticed was how quiet the chemistry lab felt, for a room that looked like it had been in the middle of a war. It wasn't just the debris, plaster dust and broken tiles, lengths of conduit, cardboard boxes half collapsed like someone had stepped on them in a hurry. It was the way the mess had a pattern to it, the way certain surfaces were wiped clean while others were left to rot in clutter, as if the person who'd last been here had cared about only one thing and everything else could burn. This was Stark Hall at Wilkes University in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, an old science building that had been torn open for renovation. On the afternoon of September 30th, 1991, it was supposed to be the kind of place investigators walked through for paperwork reasons and then forgot about. But the detective didn't forget. He moved carefully, boots scuffing through dust, eyes tracking countertops and sink basins, and the dim corners where old equipment waited under plastic sheets. The lab smelled like chemicals that had long ago stopped having names and started being remembered only as warnings. A stale bite in the throat, a faint metallic tang that made the tongue feel coated. He told himself to keep it simple. Find whatever the university said might still be here. Photograph it, bag it, leave. Then he saw the rag. It lay on a countertop near the center of the room, so ordinary at first glance. Just cloth, crumpled, darkened with grime. But it was placed there, not dropped, and beside it sat a small piece of paper, handwritten. The ink pressed hard enough into the page that the letters looked bruised. The detective leaned in close enough to read it without touching anything. Thallium wiping rag. Touch me and die. For a moment, he just stared, the way you stare at a sentence that refuses to be real. Thallium was not a word most people carried around in their heads. It wasn't bleach or ammonia or the kind of thing you spilled under your sink and forgot about. Thallium was the kind of poison you heard about in old stories. The kind with a clinical coldness to it. The kind that didn't just kill you. Sometimes it unmade you first. The detective felt the skin tighten across the back of his neck. His hand hovered, indecisive. A ridiculous thought arrived fully formed and humiliating. What if I already touched it? What if I brushed the counter, or the rag brushed my sleeve? He stepped back, then back again, as if distance could undo a mistake. And in that reflex, fear before logic, he finally understood what the lab truly was. Not just a mess, not just a renovation site. A place someone wanted to point to. A place someone wanted to turn into an answer. Touch me and die, the note said. But the detective couldn't stop thinking the real message was simpler and far more personal. You're looking in the right place, so keep looking and see what it costs you. 6 weeks earlier, Monday, August the 19th, 1991, Bobby Curley had stood in his recently renovated kitchen, barefoot on cool linoleum, feeling like life was finally beginning to loosen its grip. The duplex was small, working class, the kind of place where the walls carried every sound from the neighbors, where you learned to keep your own joys quiet. But the kitchen looked new. Bobby and his brother had worked on it with the kind of stubborn pride men bring to things they can fix with their hands. Cabinets squared, counter sealed, nothing fancy but solid. The room smelled faintly of sawdust that had gotten into the seams and never fully left. Bobby opened the fridge, reached for his lunch bag, and lifted his thermos. Heavy, familiar. Behind him, Joanne moved in the soft morning way of someone trying not to wake a child too early. Her daughter, Angela, was 4, and the house revolved around her in a gentle orbit. Shoes by the door, cartoon cups in the cabinet, tiny socks that vanished like magic. Bobby kissed Joanne on the cheek. "Love you," he said. She returned it, quick, almost automatic, but she smiled. That morning she did. They'd been married about a year. It hadn't been a long romance, not the kind that gets rewritten into family legend, but it had felt steady. Bobby wasn't a poetic man. He was practical. When he loved you, he showed it by fixing things before they broke, by making sure the bills were paid, by putting his body into work so the people in his house could breathe easier. And lately, they'd been talking about breathing easier for real, because Joanne's lawsuit, the one tied to her first husband's death, was finally nearing settlement. Her first husband had died in a tractor-trailer crash years earlier, leaving Joanne a widow with a toddler. The legal fight had dragged, grinding slow, and Bobby had watched it wear her down in quiet ways, shorter patience, longer silences, moods that seemed to turn without warning. But now it looked like it was almost over. The number that floated between them, never fully spoken like it might jinx itself, was more than $1 million. Money like that didn't feel like wealth. It felt like oxygen. They talked about trips for Angela, about a home they could build, about Bobby finally starting his own electrical contracting business, something he'd wanted for years but never had the cushion to risk. Not today, though. Today he had a job site, a crew, a science building at Wilkes University. He picked up his keys, stepped out into the morning, and drove into the day like a man who thought the future was opening. The science building had become routine. Bobby parked, saw his crew waiting by the doors, and greeted them with the easy familiarity of men who had spent months together in shared fatigue. He was the foreman. That meant he unlocked the place. That meant if something went wrong, it was his name people said first. Inside, the building still looked like a space in transition. Renovation work had a particular smell: old plaster, fresh wiring, the dry powder of things being torn out and replaced. There had been delays from the start. The job was supposed to be prepped for them. Equipment removed, rooms cleared. It wasn't, especially not the chemistry lab. The lab still held flasks and bottles, half-labeled shelves, rags that looked like they'd been used to wipe something unpleasant. Bobby's crew had spent too much time cleaning up things they hadn't expected to touch. It had forced longer days, 12-hour stretches that left Bobby drained in the way hard workers often describe as just tired, because admitting anything else feels like weakness. He told himself it was normal. And for a while it was. Then one afternoon, standing on a ladder in that chemistry lab, pulling wire through ceiling space, he heard shouting, laughter, the kind that comes when grown men revert to boys because exhaustion needs a release. He climbed down and found his crew circled around a coworker who was coughing hard, face red, spitting into the sink. Someone had swapped his drink with something disgusting, chewing tobacco spit, a prank meant to gross out, not harm. The room filled with laughter. Even the victim laughed once he recovered, gagging and swearing revenge in a way that made everybody grin. Bobby shook his head, half amused, half disgusted. "You idiots," he said, smiling anyway. Then he went back to work. Halfway up the ladder, a wave of sickness rolled through him, sudden, cold, and heavy, like the beginning of the flu. He gripped the rung and waited it out, eyes closed, jaw tight. It passed. He told himself the same thing he always told himself. Suck it up. And he kept wiring. Because that's what Bobby did. He kept going. 4 days later, Friday, August the 23rd, his body stopped pretending. Crossing the parking lot, he felt like his feet had been filled with wet sand. His breath came short and unsatisfying, as if his lungs were refusing to finish the job. In the lab, sweat soaked him. Not the normal work sweat, but the kind that made people glance at you and then glance again. His co-workers asked if he was okay. "I'm fine," he said, because that's what he always said. He made it through the day by sheer momentum. That night, the relief of going home felt almost like triumph. Bed, quiet, sleep. But by Saturday morning, the heaviness in his legs had turned into burning pain, climbing upward as if something inside him was crawling. His hands went numb. He went to a doctor, because at that point denial became embarrassing even to him. The doctor didn't see an emergency. He told Bobby it wasn't serious, advised rest, sent him home. So Bobby did what he'd been told. He lay in bed all Saturday, all Sunday, staring at the ceiling, listening to Angela's small sounds downstairs, feeling his body fail in increments. Sunday evening, he did something he hated doing. He called work and said he wouldn't be in Monday. When he woke Monday morning, he tried to stand and couldn't. His legs refused to hold him. The pain was so deep it didn't even feel like pain anymore. It felt like a message from somewhere beyond the nerves, a kind of screaming from the bones. Joanne tried to help him to the bathroom and couldn't. Bobby was too heavy, dead weight. She called Bobby's brother. When David arrived, he found his brother reduced to something frightening, sweating, shaking, helpless in a way that made David's face go pale. "Ambulance," David said. It wasn't a suggestion. At the hospital, Bobby screamed. He vomited. Nurses and doctors ran tests while he clenched his teeth until his jaw ached from resisting the urge to beg. Hours later, a doctor came in with what sounded like relief. A diagnosis: Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological disorder, treatable, medication, time, recovery. Bobby felt something inside him unclench. Joanne exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. David tried to believe it. The medication helped, at least at first. The pain became tolerable. The vomiting stopped. Bobby went home. For a moment, the story looked like it was turning back toward normal. Then, within days, the pain returned. Worse, sharper, more constant, like his nerves were being rubbed raw. And then his hair started falling out. Not a little. Clumps in the sink. Strands on his pillow. He ran a hand through his hair one morning and came away holding more of himself than should ever be in a palm. He stared at it, confused, and some part of him finally admitted, "This isn't a strange illness. This is something else." By early September, he was back in the hospital, first at Wilkes-Barre General, and then, when nobody could explain the hair loss and the escalating agony, he was transferred to a larger facility in Hershey. In Hershey, the doctors began to suspect what they didn't want to say aloud: poisoning. Thallium, a heavy metal once used in rat poison, so toxic that even small exposure can wreck a body in ways that mimic other illnesses, that confuse tests, that turn nerves into fire. Bobby's pain became unmanageable. He screamed, cursed, thrashed. He wasn't that kind of man, not the dramatic kind. Watching him unravel was like watching a wall crack. They restrained him because there was no other way to keep him from ripping at himself or tearing equipment from the bed, leather straps across limbs. The humiliation of being held down like a danger to others when he was only a danger to himself. Joanne came often. David came when he could. Bobby's mother came, older and frightened, carrying the look of someone who has already lost too much and can't believe the universe is asking again. The tests came back too late to matter in the way people mean when they say "in time." They found thallium toxicity, and by then Bobby's brain was swelling, his body collapsing into a place Medical care couldn't follow. On September 22nd, he slipped into a coma. A few days later, the family stood around his bed, waiting for meaning, waiting for a cure. There wasn't one. On September 25th, while Bobby lay comatose, Joanne's wrongful death lawsuit, tied to casually a tragedy years earlier, reached a settlement of more than $1 million. 2 days later, on September 27th, Bobby was removed from a life support. Joanne nodded to the medical staff. The ventilator came away. Bobby took his final breath. And in the quiet that followed, it wasn't the death itself that felt most terrible. It was how long he had spent dying, how slowly something invisible had dismantled him, and how many people had stood nearby, loving him, watching him, without understanding what they were really watching. A month later, 8 men sat around a table in a Wilkes Barre steakhouse, their plates cooling as they talked about a death that didn't behave like an accident. They were investigators, coroners, men who had seen bodies and learned not to flinch. But this case had a different weight. Because thallium wasn't supposed to be easy. It wasn't supposed to be casual. It wasn't supposed to show up in a working man's body at that level. The autopsy findings were staggering, 900 times the lethal amount. The first assumption, almost unavoidable, was the university lab. Bobby had worked in a building with chemicals. The chemistry lab contained thallium in bottles. So investigators went there. They found thallium containers in storage. They found the rag and the note. The note warned about death in a handwriting that felt like someone trying to be clever. It caused panic, because even investigators aren't immune to the primal fear of invisible poison. But the rag tested negative. Surfaces tested negative. Air tests came back clean. OSHA inventoried the lab chemicals and found none missing. Co-workers were tested and showed no thallium poisoning. And yet Bobby had died of thallium. If it wasn't the lab, then where? Then something stranger. Bobby's wife and stepdaughter, Joanne and Angela, showed traces of thallium exposure. Small but real. Not enough to kill them, but enough to raise a question nobody wanted to ask. How does a family get exposed lightly while the husband dies saturated in poison? The men at the table kept circling the same truth. This didn't look like a single moment. It looked like a pattern, and patterns meant intent. When the lead detective finally sat across from Joanne in an interview room, he watched her the way experienced investigators watch people. Not for tears or drama, but for the small betrayals, the timing of breaths, the ease of certain answers, the places where the story gets too polished. Joanne brought a lawyer. She explained what she could. Bobby had been tired for weeks, maybe months. She thought it was overwork. She'd never heard of thallium. She didn't know how anybody would even get it. She didn't cry. Not once. It wasn't proof of anything. Grief comes in ugly shapes, and shock can look like coldness. But it sat wrong. Then the detective asked the question the table of men had been saving. How do you explain the thallium in you and your daughter? Joanne had an answer ready. Bobby liked iced tea at work, she said. Every morning she filled his thermos from a pitcher in the fridge. Some days he brought it home with tea still inside, and she poured the leftover back into the pitcher, salvaging it. She and Angela drank from the same pitcher. So if Bobby was being exposed somewhere else, maybe it carried back in the thermos. Maybe it mixed into the tea. Maybe that's how she and Angela got trace exposure. It was a bizarre explanation, but it had one quality investigators fear. It made a kind of sense. That afternoon, a crime scene unit searched the duplex. They found no thallium on surfaces. Not in the air. Not in the house in the way you'd expect if a chemical had spilled or lingered. But they did find traces on the thermos, on the ridges near the top, where the lid screwed on. That mattered. It suggested ingestion. It suggested routine. It suggested that whatever was happening was traveling with Bobby, day after day, like a quiet companion. And it sent them back toward the place they had tried to rule out, the university lab. Months became a year of interviews, theories, and the slow frustration of a case that wouldn't lock into a single suspect without slipping away again. Investigators looked hard at co-workers. They considered pranks taken too far. They considered resentment. They considered stupid cruelty wearing the mask of humor. But they couldn't prove missing thallium from the lab. They couldn't place poison in anyone's hands. They couldn't find a clean motive that held up under scrutiny. They also watched Joanne. They watched Bobby's brother. They watched everybody close enough to Bobby to touch his life. Because poison isn't like a gunshot. It's intimate. It requires access. It requires patience. And in the end, patience was what the case demanded most. Because despite the suspicion, despite the theories, despite the thermos, the district attorney's office eventually did what prosecutors do when they can't see a conviction. They shut it down. A homicide without a killer becomes a drawer, a file, a cold weight. The lead detective closed the folder and slid it away. And Bobby Curley's death became one more mystery that families carry like a stone. In August of 1994, nearly 3 years after Bobby died, the lead detective walked back up to Joanne's duplex. This time, he came with a new promise, a technological breakthrough in toxicology, a way to learn what old tests couldn't. But it required something invasive, almost sacrilegious in its bluntness. They would have to exhume Bobby's body. Joanne listened. Her response would decide whether the story ended in a drawer or moved back into daylight. She said yes. Later that month, the detective stood in the cemetery and watched a backhoe dig into the earth. Dirt peeled away like layers of reluctant memory. The casket emerged, mud-stained and heavy, hauled up from the ground as if the past itself had been dragged into the air. 2 forensic experts conducted a second autopsy, Michael Baden and Frederick Reeders, and they focused on something that seemed almost absurd in its simplicity: Bobby's hair. Because hair is a timeline, a record of what passed through the body month by month. And when the results came back, they didn't just show poison. They showed pattern. At least 7 separate occasions over the last 11 months of Bobby's life when he ingested thallium. The poisoning hadn't started at the university job. It had started earlier. That meant co-workers, the easy suspect, the convenient answer, fell away. It meant Bobby's brother's involvement became harder to fit. It meant the killer had likely been close to Bobby long before the lab, close enough to touch his food, close enough to touch his drink, close enough to watch him suffer and still keep going. When police reconstructed what they believed happened, the story that emerged wasn't a single monstrous act. It was months of decision. Small doses first, careful, incremental, meant to look like sickness or exhaustion. A slow erosion of a man's nerves and strength, enough to weaken him, not enough to make him suspicious right away. Then, when he finally collapsed into hospitals, when doctors misdiagnosed and discharged and readmitted, when everyone around him began to understand that this wasn't normal, the final dose arrived in the only place Bobby had left, where he was truly vulnerable, his hospital bed. And the reason that final act mattered why it crossed from cruelty into something colder, was that Bobby drank without hesitation. Not because he was foolish, because he trusted. And trust, in the end, was the weapon. On December 12, 1996, authorities arrested Joanne Curley and charged her in Bobby's death. Prosecutors argued the motive was financial, life insurance, and sole control over the settlement money from her first husband's wrongful death case. Years later, she was still the name at the center of the story, because thallium required access and patience, and the timeline in Bobby's hair pointed to someone with constant, ordinary proximity. Joanne eventually reached a plea deal and served a sentence that ended decades later, released in 2016 after serving 20 years. But the residue, the part that never goes away cleanly, is simpler than court dates or lab reports. It's the image of Bobby in that renovated kitchen, lifting his thermos like it's nothing, kissing his wife goodbye and walking out the door. A man stepping into an ordinary day, already carrying the thing that would kill him, and the unbearable thought that the worst danger in his life didn't come from a university lab or a co-worker's cruel prank or a hidden chemical on a rag. It came from the place most people stopped looking, from the person you let close enough to pour your drink. This was Midnight Horror Society, dark curiosity for sleep. Until your next midnight session, sleep well.